The prison walls were never silent. Even at midnight, when the world outside slept, the whispers of the damned traveled through the cracks, footsteps, muffled cries, the clang of metal against metal. For 20 years, Adrian Cole listened. Every sound, every face, every shadow in that place etched itself into his memory. 20 years was enough time to plan perfection. He hadn't spoken much since the day of his conviction. The courtroom had been packed, the media ravenous for blood. Corporate saboteur, they'd called him. Disgruntled employee turned criminal. They said he'd caused the explosion that killed 5 people at Tech Industries, a company he once helped build from scratch. But Adrian knew the truth. The man who'd set him up was sitting 3 rows behind the prosecutor, wearing a smug smile and a $10,000 suit. Daniel Mercer, his former best friend and business partner. Adrian remembered the moment the verdict was read. The sound of the gavel, sharp and final, was the same as a door slamming shut on his life. He'd looked once toward Mercer, who met his gaze without flinching. No remorse, just satisfaction. That was when Adrian's silence began. Not out of despair, but focus. The first 5 years in prison were survival. The next 15 were about learning. Adrian found allies where others saw enemies. He helped inmates draft appeals, taught himself law in the dusty corners of the library, and befriended a hacker who'd once crippled a bank's firewall for sport. Slowly, he built a network. Men who owed him favors, men who would one day act on his behalf. He wrote letters under false names, planted seeds through correspondence that stretched beyond the prison walls. Every piece of the puzzle moved in silence. By the time he was released on parole, old, gray at the temples, and forgotten by the media, Adrian Cole was no longer the broken man who went in. He was something else entirely. The world had changed in 20 years, but corruption hadn't. Daniel Mercer was now the CEO of a global tech conglomerate, praised for his innovation and philanthropy. His face was on magazine covers, his speeches broadcast at summits. The perfect man, the perfect lie. But what Mercer didn't know was that his empire was built on sand, and Adrian had spent 2 decades studying the tides. Adrian started small. A new identity. A quiet apartment in a city far from his old life. His parole officer thought he was just another weary ex-con trying to stay clean. He took a job as a data analyst under an alias, blending into the background like he always had. From there, he began to tug at threads, shell companies, offshore accounts, research files Mercer had buried long ago. Adrian's mind was still a machine, sharper now, fueled by vengeance instead of ambition. Then came phase 2. A quiet email to a journalist, disguised as an anonymous whistleblower. A leak of documents that showed Masterclass's earliest patents were stolen from Adrian. Another to a cybersecurity firm hinting that Mercer's company used manipulated encryption. Within weeks, whispers began to spread. Stocks dipped. Investors grew restless. And through it all, Adrian never surfaced. He moved like a ghost through digital corridors, always 2 steps ahead. When the first public scandal broke, a bribery case tied to one of Mercer's subsidiaries, Adrian watched it unfold on a small television in his apartment, his face expressionless. It was only the beginning. One by one, the dominoes fell. Anonymous sources revealed corruption, tax fraud, manipulation of environmental data. Investigations opened. Lawsuits piled up. Mercer's empire began to crack, but Adrian wasn't done. Revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about justice, slow, deliberate, and undeniable. In the final stage, Adrian targeted the man himself. Mercer's private accounts, encrypted emails, personal communications, all hacked. Adrian sent one message from an address Mercer hadn't seen in 2 decades. Do you remember the explosion? Within minutes, Mercer's composure shattered. He contacted his lawyers, security experts, the board. But there was no one to save him. Every secret he'd buried, every person he'd stepped on, every crime he'd covered up came flooding into daylight. And then came the police. The same press that once called Adrian a monster now called Mercer a fraud. When the trial began, Adrian didn't attend. He watched from afar, sitting in a quiet cafe, stirring his coffee as Mercer faced the same judge who had once sentenced him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mercer received 30 years without parole. The same number Adrian had once been given, reduced to 20 for good behavior. The day the verdict was read, Adrian walked out into the rain, letting the drops soak his face. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt the weight lift. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. He had reclaimed his truth, piece by piece, until the scales finally balanced. But even then, he didn't disappear. He donated anonymously to the families of the explosion victims, ensuring they learned who really caused their pain. He vanished from the public record soon after, leaving no trace behind, just whispers, like those in the prison walls where it all began. Some said he fled the country. Others believed he died quietly in some forgotten town. But those who truly knew his story said he didn't need to run. He'd already served his sentence and made the world his prison instead. And somewhere, far from the noise of the world, Adrian Cole sat beneath a dying sunset, eyes closed, the sound of freedom in his breath. 20 years stolen, 20 years avenged. The grudge was finally over. Years passed after Mercer's downfall, but the world rarely lets go of a good story. The headlines lingered, the documentaries followed, and the public ate up every ounce of drama between the fallen CEO and the ghost of a man he betrayed. But Adrian Cole never cared for fame. He didn't crave vindication in the eyes of strangers, only balance. Yet vengeance, once set in motion, doesn't stop easily. Adrian thought his war was over. He'd watched Mercer taken away in handcuffs, the same way he had been 20 years ago. He thought that would be enough, the symmetry, the poetic justice. But silence, once familiar, returned like a haunting melody, the kind that filled the nights in his cell, whispering doubts through the dark. Was justice ever truly done? Or had he merely traded one prison for another? He lived quietly under a new name in a coastal town, working as a bookkeeper at a small marina. No one there knew who he was. The sea, endless and patient, became his closest companion. He'd spend hours sitting by the pier, sketching diagrams in a worn notebook, not of vengeance this time, but of something softer. Redemption, perhaps. A life rebuilt. But ghosts have a way of finding their way home. One morning, he received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a teenage girl standing beside a car. Her smile was identical to Daniel Mercer's. On the back, 3 words were written: "She deserves truth." Adrian stared at it for hours. Mercer had a daughter, born while Adrian was rotting in a cell. She would have grown up hearing stories of her father, the genius, the visionary, the man who was wronged by his unstable partner. Lies built on lies. And now, someone wanted her to know the truth. He could have ignored it. He should have. But the weight of the photo dug into him. He remembered the victims of that explosion, the lives ruined and the years stolen. If Mercer's daughter lived under the shadow of a false legacy, wasn't that just another form of deceit? And so, Adrian began again, not as a destroyer this time, but as a messenger. He gathered every file, every confession, every recording that proved the depth of Mercer's treachery. He compiled it meticulously, not out of anger but duty. The last piece of truth left to set right. He mailed the package to her anonymously. Weeks later, he saw her face on television, standing before reporters, her voice trembling but resolute. "My father built his empire on lies," she said. "And I believe the man he wronged deserves peace." The media storm reignited briefly. Adrian didn't watch much of it. He didn't need to. The truth was out, not for revenge this time, but for release. For both of them. One evening, as the sun melted into the sea, Adrian walked down the dock one last time. The waves slapped gently against the wood, steady and eternal. He placed his old notebook, the one that had guided his 20-year plan, on the edge of the pier and let the wind take it. Pages scattered, drifting across the water like ghosts finally freed. He smiled faintly, not the smile of a victor, but of a man who had finally stopped fighting. Some say he disappeared soon after, leaving his rented cabin unlocked, his few possessions untouched. Others claimed to have seen him boarding a ship heading towards South America, traveling under another name. But the truth is simpler. Adrian Cole had lived two lives, one stolen, one avenged. Both had finally run their course. In the end, his story became a whisper, like the ones that filled his nights in prison long ago. A whisper of justice, of patience, of how a man broken by betrayal rebuilt himself with nothing but time, intellect, and unrelenting will. The world remembered Daniel Mercer as a fallen mogul and Adrian Cole as the ghost who brought him down. But in truth, Adrian's greatest act wasn't revenge. It was walking away, leaving behind the ashes of his past and stepping into the quiet peace he had earned one breath at a time. And as the waves swallowed the last of the papers, the story of the 20-year grudge finally ended, not in rage, but in silence.